On tonight's episode of Locked On Lightning, the Bolts fall again in Philly, and we also ask the question, do things trade at the deadline because of these other wins that occurred recently? We break it all down coming up and more on Locked On Lightning.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Danker. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Locked On Lightning. Today's episode, we're talking about the Bolts once again falling in just an unmajestic way out in Philadelphia. We talk about possibly the plans changing for the deadline. We'll break that down. And trade target updates. What does that mean? You'll have to find out and stick around. But before we get into that, please, I want to remind you that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. And I also want to remind you, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel. Hit that comment section below, as well as the thumbs up button, so it helps the podcast grow, as well as the episodes spread better around YouTube on the algorithm. So right now we're talking about the ending to the game last night. If you tuned into last night's episode, I believe we were in the middle of the second period, or maybe not even. I don't even think we were in the second period yet, but yeah, because the Lightning, they did not score their goal yet. But nonetheless, they did end up tying that game after some issues early on. But did eventually fall in this one 6-2. So just a little bit of an update. In case you didn't watch the game last night, we left it off in the first period. Bobby Brink scored on I wouldn't say it a breakaway goal, but it was nonetheless off a turnover, and obviously a thing that the Lightning struggled with early on in this game, because, and you never want to see this early on in the game. I don't care who you're playing. I don't care how you're playing leading up to that game. But whenever you start off a game, and I'm not saying this is the whole reasoning as for why this team lost last night, but it's definitely disheartening when you're coming off two straight wins, and it doesn't matter who you play. I know that I spoke in the last episode or two, whatever, that we should have been happy for that 2-game win streak. But I will say, we had to maybe temper our excitement given who those wins were against and the circumstances of those two teams. But nonetheless, you would figure that some sort of momentum would have been gained in those 2 wins, regardless of how many days off. But as we know, and I feel like to a certain extent accustomed to with this team, is that they are it is very difficult for them to get things going, regardless of the current win streak or whatever the case may be. From game to game, it is very difficult for them to really carry over performance. I mean, you could even look at those 2 wins, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that you look at this team early on, and you're on the road, and you're going up against a very good team in the Philadelphia Flyers. Like I said, I do not believe that they are going to make the moves that a lot of people are projecting them to make. But when you look at the way the Lightning played early on, they only had 5 shots in the first period. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they were not able to get things going in early on. There was a ton of what really bothered me the most, and I stated on the episode last night, is that they get the puck, they go into the zone, and right away they turn it over, and now it's a race back down the other way. And you saw that lead to the Bobby Brink goal early on. Nick Paul gets one back in the second period. Really, great goal on this. I mean, it wasn't so much Nick Paul. It was more so the pass from Hagel from the angle that he did it, and just it just furthers the conversation, if not only solidifies it, that the Hagel trade was by far the best trade Julian Brees has made during his tenure here with the Tampa Bay Lightning. And going into the third period, though, that's when it falls apart for the Tampa Bay Lightning. The Flyers score 5 goals. 5 goals. And you could say this happened or that happened. When it comes down to it, especially when you're going into a period tied and it just completely unfolds in the way it did, it is easy to make the assumption, and the correct assumption, especially with this team, that at the end of the day, what really was the issue and continues to be the issue for this Tampa Bay Lightning team is their lack of depth. And that is really the reason why this team is just really unable to play a full 60-minute game. And that is going to continue to be the issue until it is corrected. And it is really disappointing because you kind of felt, even though there wasn't exactly a blatant, it wasn't exactly clear that the Lightning were starting to gain control of the game. And I'm not even going to say that. What I'm going to say is that it seemed as though things slowly started to turn. Now, obviously, going into the third period and even, I just got done talking about the Lightning's inability to carry over momentum from game to game. I mean, really, if you want to break it down more, it's really from period to period. And that just shows you how thin they are. But that comes down really to the group itself. There are instances where you can persevere despite the lack of talent that you have on your side. On paper, I can confidently say that Tampa and Philly are evenly matched in terms of personnel. Philly might have an advantage in certain aspects of the game that Tampa may not, and vice versa. You would really expect in this game, and this goes back to my point last night about Andrei Vasilevskiy, is that in a game like this is the game where once Hagel and Paul get one back for you, going into that third period, that's where Vasilevskiy, or at least you would expect Andrei Vasilevskiy to flip a switch. And I've said it time and time again here on this podcast, is that, yes, the defense on this team is just really lackluster. But at the end of the day, there are certain times with your goaltender that you expect him to kind of pick you up. And this was one of those games. I'm not, like I said, and I'm going to continue to say this, is that I don't expect Vasilevskiy to go out there and play spectacular every night. If we get one spectacular performance where he is absolutely incredible, because that's really, the truth is that's what he gets paid to do. If we get maybe one performance of truly spectacularly goaltending within a span of 10 games, I'll take it. I was looking for that one game last night, and quite frankly, I mean, even his shutout that he had earlier this season, I don't really think we could confidently say that that was a spectacular performance. But all around, a group effort loss for this Tampa Bay Lightning team. All we could do, as we always do on this show, is hope that they could get it together, and in their next matchup, they will be facing the Buffalo Sabres. So let me know in the comments below how you're feeling about last night's loss. I mean, all it does, and maybe this is a positive thing in the long term that, it forces your organization more into even considering possibly partially rebuilding, possibly selling. We're going to talk about all that coming up and more because, I think that maybe some people coming out of the weekend kind of thought things were starting to turn around, and maybe sometimes that could change plans at the deadline. So coming up in just a little bit, we'll talk about that. But first, I want to talk about our friends, and that is our first sponsors of today's show, and that is our friends over at the Gametime app. Now, listen, you shouldn't have to worry when you buy tickets to your next big event. Gametime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you with killer last-minute deals and all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. I love the fact that not only it allows you to buy last-minute tickets, but it has last-minute flash deals. So, tickets that normally go for maybe $100 each, and you're rushing into the event or a comedy event or play or musical or sporting event, whatever event you want to go to, and you want to get tickets last minute, guess what? Those tickets that are normally $100, they could be $60 or even $50 or $40. It all depends on the flash deal. The other thing I love about this app is the view from your seat. Gone are the days of sitting behind poles and obstructed views. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. And as always, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel there. Hit that thumbs up button below this video and drop a comment below. Let me know how I'm doing. Listen, because I'm here to talk about the Lightning. Sometimes I kind of let my own feelings about certain topics get the best of me. That's what happens, okay? And the best way, I feed off the emotions of this. I feed off you guys as well, your opinions. I may not always be able to address them, because I have things planned beforehand, but sometimes I try to fit them in. I said it last night, and you guys did not disappoint. The feedback about the Jeff Blashill conversation, the topic, if you didn't tune in last night, about him possibly being the scapegoat in all of this, I liked the direction in which a lot of you went, and this goes for the listeners on Twitter, because I did tweet something out this morning as well about it. And I have to say, I'm very surprised. I kind of figured that a lot of you were going to go at me about, he's really the real problem here, where a lot of you were honest. And I respect that you were saying it's not just him. I mean, it can be a little bit of him. Listen, at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer the buck stops with Cooper. If he thinks Blashill's not doing a good job, or fails to recognize that Blashill's not doing a good job, or can't realize that the lack thereof defense production possibly correlates with the arrival of Jeff Blashill, then guess what? That's Cooper's problem, and Cooper needs to be held responsible. I'm not saying he loses his job, but I think that it is the responsibility of all of us to kind of hold him responsible as well. But I really have to say, I really liked a lot of the feedback that you all gave me. Talking about Vasilevsky, talking about the depth, the roster, all of it. I love it. Keep up that enthusiasm, because we're definitely going to be talking about a lot of the issues around this team continuously over the next couple of weeks, and especially with the trade deadline coming up in the next week or so, next Friday, actually. So definitely going to be talking about it, and we're going to probably spend a couple of episodes talking about, once the trade deadline is done, after the dust settles, what's going to go on. But all we could do right now is look forward towards the trade deadline, because some people, I probably said it last week. I may have said it the week before. Probably not. I think it was only last week. That's when the forest was burning down all around us. Is that I felt that it was time to call the time of death. I think it was the right time to say, all right, let's not trade everyone, of course. I still think that there's a good group of guys on this team, a good foundation. But, now would have been the nice time within the organization to talk maybe with Stamkos, what he's feeling, maybe see if he wants to maybe go somewhere else. But I was very curious because, as we often do here in Lightning Land, is that when the highs are high, they are very high. 2 weeks ago, like I said, and have addressed continuously, we were talking about possibly contending for the number one spot in the division after defeating Boston and Colorado in back-to-back matchups. And then within a span of 3 games, now we're talking about the possibility of selling. And I don't know how some other people feel about it, but I will say from my point of view, I think that the plan should still be and should have really always been, unless the Lightning were in a better spot in the standings, is that if you want to still compete for the playoffs, that is fine. And what I mean by that is compete for a playoff spot. As for possibly going all in on a playoff run, I think that would be very foolish. I think that it would also show a lack of attentiveness to where this team is right now and where they could potentially be in the next 3 to 5 years, really. And I'm not saying that the Lightning should completely implode it all and really start thinking about, the next 5 years. No, I'm saying, like, my plan, just putting on my GM hat right now, is that I firmly believe that it is very possible with the way this roster is constructed and the assets that the Lightning currently have, mainly just draft picks, and some lower tier players at the NHL level, and maybe some prospects if you're open to the possibility of trading Isaac Howard. I think that it is not too crazy of a thing to say that we could potentially be in a situation where the Lightning, and it's very possible, like I said, the Lightning can trade certain pieces to make themselves better in the short term while also setting themselves up for the future. And I'm still the biggest proponent of this. I still believe that all starts with the acquisition of Noah Hannafin from the Calgary Flames. I think that if you want to get a little greedy with it, maybe you could get Blake Coleman in that deal. As for the possibility of that happening now, given just before this podcast was started recording, it was announced that the Calgary Flames did trade Chris Tanev. So we're going to address that at the end. But they did, to my understanding, they did retain a good amount of his contract. It looked like the Flames retained 50% of his contract for this year as well as next year. I actually know this year, excuse me. So that's not a bad thing. I mean, but it does make things a little murky in terms of what actually, wait, no, they end up not. Yeah, they actually do. Mike, I'm still reading this in real time, but it's going to be very interesting to see how Calgary reacts to that, especially because now that the first domino has fallen in Calgary, what exactly happens. And that may very well change things for the Tampa Bay Lightning in terms of what their trade deadline plans might be. But I firmly believe, though, that really these back-to-back wins, winning 2 of 3 on the road right now, and especially if you beat Buffalo, I don't think you should go into next week with really any sort of changes of mindset when it comes to what you should be doing at the deadline to make this team better, to improve upon this team. And like I said, it is still very possible, given the nature of this roster, given the nature of, the picks, that the Lightning could very well make a trade, whether it be for Noah Hannafin or somebody else, because we did mention some other names on that trade target list. If you want to go back and listen to the episode, you can. I did a whole segment about it. I think I did probably more than just the whole segment on it. I probably spent the entire episode. But just to reiterate for those who maybe missed it, I had Hannafin at first. I had Sean Walker from the Flyers, just because, his name has been thrown around quite a bit. At this list, I just want to remind people, it doesn't necessarily reflect the likelihood of certain people getting moved to Tampa Bay. But still, nonetheless, I think that his name, given that, in the 5% chance that I give Philadelphia in moving him, he would be very high on the list for the Lightning if that were a deal that were going to actually be taking place. And then you have Frank Vetrano, a winger from Anaheim, a deal that I think could potentially be very likely if the Lightning do call the Ducks. As we said, as I said in the time, I had Chris Tanev from Calgary as number 4. You could cross him off that list, obviously. Pavel Buchnevich from the St. Louis Blues. He's at 5, but now at 4. That's another deal. I think that if the Lightning were to call St. Louis and inquire about Buchnevich, that is a deal that could potentially be fruitful for the Lightning. And then, like I said on the other episode, last night's episode, actually, there's a little rumor going around that stating that it is possible that the Lightning could be in the raffle or the contest, whatever you want to call it, for Eric Johnson from the Buffalo Sabres. Now, the likelihood of that, I think that making a deal with a division rival, I think, is far less likely than the Lightning making a deal with the Philadelphia Flyers, just because I think it's more of a pride thing. I don't think a division rival is going to trade within the division, regardless of the status of that contract. So let me know in the comments below, do you think we should full out sell? Do you think we should full out buy in, somewhere in the middle, like where I was, kind of just doing a little bit of both? I think that in terms of the logistics of doing all three, I think it's a possibility. I think it could potentially be also a possibility depending on, where the Lightning are at in the standings. Because, as much as I've killed them on recent episodes, you still look at the standings as of tonight. They're only 3 out of, 3 away from the Detroit Red Wings in the points department. The Devils are 5 behind. So, they still have an arm's length away from the Devils, but not to the point to where one could feel comfortable about that. I think, especially with how drastically things change in the NHL, and especially with this team. So coming up in just a little bit, we're going to continue our conversation about the updated targets list because, one of those targets got traded tonight. So obviously the likelihood of him being in Tampa Bay is very unlikely at this point. But before we get into all of that, before we open up another one of Pandora's boxes, we're going to talk about our last sponsor on tonight's show, and that is our friends over at eBay Motors. Now, passion, drive, and patience is what brings home the winning trophy, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit to your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep a ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit. Only available to U.S. customers. So one last time for today's episode, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, like I said, please go ahead, subscribe, whether you're listening to us on an audio-based platform, whether it be Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher. I'm sure I'm missing some more. Wherever you could download or listen to a podcast, we are there. And if you're listening to us on an app-based platform, YouTube, or any of the other ones that are an audio file, hit that subscribe button. Please go ahead. It helps the show grow. It helps us spread the word, all that fun stuff. So we're wrapping things up real quick, talking about trade targets updated, because Chris Tanev is now a member of the Dallas Stars. That's a good move for them. I think that they're a team that I firmly believe if they start rolling on all cylinders, or if they could get, they're one of those teams where if everything clicks, the rest of the NHL is going to be in a lot of trouble, mainly, obviously, the Western Conference. But looking at the other potential trade targets, as for looking at, the likelihood of these other trades, I mean, I hate to be the kind of person, but I am, that when it comes to the deadline, that you don't want to throw your hat into the whole the basket for one player, because that does one of two things. I mean, either one of the two things you want to take. I mean, it's going to set you up for disappointment unless this player absolutely blows you away. But learning my lesson from last year with the Tanner Jeannot trade, it sets you, one of two things could happen. Is your team can totally not get this player, or they could come here and completely disappoint you. But when I look at the Noah Hanifin trade, and I look at the kind of player that he is, and then, like I've said, this goes back to my whole thing about how the Lightning can potentially build for now and build for later. And when I say build for now, that means, they could set themselves up not for a Stanley Cup trophy this season, but for at least getting out of the first round. I don't think it's going to be a move that could necessarily, be the last thing, the notch in your belt to get things going down the road. But I think it's something that, could potentially pay off now and pay later. And I think that's the best way to go, because, obviously it would be foolhardy to go all in when we saw what happened last year with the Maple Leafs. And I think we could agree, even if you add a piece, because that's what the Lightning are going to do. They're not going to go out and get like a Vladimir Tarasenko. I know that's a terrible example, but it's the first one that came to mind. If they go out and get a player that really could just go out there and help out and really be a guy that is going to be, part of the solution in terms of solving those depth issues, that's going to be something that's going to help you continue to build, because that's really what this team needs to do. And I don't see a player out there other than Hanifin that could really do that for you. He's still young. I believe he's 27 years old. But I think that he provides you a good base at a position that has really struggled this year for the Lightning. And it also kind of sets you up for down the road, because I would imagine what the thinking would be with Hanifin if he were to come here is that whether it most likely this summer, because he does become a UFA, is that I would imagine that, unless there's some sort of, he has a terrible experience with the Lightning, which I don't never heard a player having one. I feel like every player that plays for this organization has a great experience regardless of the outcome of the season. I would imagine there's going to be a very quick talks about a long-term contract. Now, as for what that dollar amount could amount to, that's a whole nother conversation to be had. But I think that it helps you out in the future because there's still a lot of uncertainty at the back end for this team, especially. Hedman, he's still, I think he's still usable. I still think he's effective, but I think the days of him being that Victor Hedman that was top 3, top 5 in the league, those are long gone. He's not that player anymore. Eric Chernak has had, overall, in my opinion, a decent season. Kyle Sergachev, barring some complications with his injury, I think he'll bounce back and have a good year next year. Nick Pervix, it's time to put him in a cannon and shoot him to the moon because I don't want to see him on this team anymore. I'm sure he's a nice guy, but I don't find anything about his game beneficial to this team. And then as for Calvin DeHaan, I was very much let down by his performance this year. Hayden Fleury, I think he's had his moments. He hasn't played enough to where I could really feel confident that he's going to be a good player for this team down the stretch. But with Hanifin, I feel like you get yourself, or it doesn't even have to be Hanifin. It could be, if you get a Sean Walker, and I'm sure there's a ton of other defensemen that I'm totally missing. But if you want to throw Eric Johnson in there as well, be my guest. But really, I think that regardless of who you get at the deadline, because it's going to be a defenseman, unless they completely screw this up, I firmly believe this is going to be someone that's going to be around for quite some time, which is why the Tanev trade the fact that it happened is almost a relief that it did. Because he's kind of, I believe he's 34 years old, so that wouldn't have made sense for the long term. It wouldn't have made sense to get a rental regardless of their age, because you're not going to do anything this year. So now is the time to build. And I'm going to update this list because, we have plenty of time. It's not even March yet, so we have plenty of time. We have over a week before the trade deadline comes. I firmly believe that there's going to be more names thrown out there. I firmly believe, I'm sure I would bet money on it that there's going to be more names connected to the Tampa Bay Lightning that probably you or I wouldn't have expected. But either way, we're going to be here. We're going to talk about it. We're going to react. But let me know in the comment sections below, whether it be on our Discord as well, on our Reddit. Are there any names that you feel like the Lightning should throw their hat in the ring for? Specifically defensemen, because, even though I have forwards on this list and have spoken probably about other forwards, that's kind of a throw-in, even in the Blake Coleman situation with Hanifin. That's just me getting greedy and somehow making the money work. One last minute, because it did pop to my mind. I did see something on the Discord today, which I have to address real quickly. I did say it on there. Someone who claims to be in the know on Twitter said that they heard from somebody, personal source, that the Lightning were in talks, or rumored to be in talks, to get Ivan Provorov, which I don't mind. But at the same time, fake news. That's all I really have to say about it. So we'll be back tomorrow. We're going to talk about the upcoming Buffalo game as well as updating our trade list. So make sure to tune in for that. So in the meantime, that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you in the next one.